Wanted to welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us today to learn about the work of the ABA Criminal Justice Section Women in Criminal Justice Task Force. Our goal today is to tell you about the formation and work of the task force. And there's been a tremendous amount of interest in our work, not just in criminal legal spaces, but also across the profession and even in other professions. We conducted some really exciting and groundbreaking work over the past 4 years. And today we'll be sharing the first steps of our work in a series called The Road to Resolution 501, which is the resolution that the ABA House of Delegates just recently adopted unanimously at its meeting in February of 2023. And that resolution is titled 10 Steps to Achieve Gender Equity in Criminal Legal Employment. So I am Mariam Marianjani. I'm a professor at the University of New Mexico School of Law, where I teach criminal law and procedure and constitutional rights, among other courses. And it's my pleasure to be here in the capacity as task force task force reporter, not co-chair, task force reporter and co-chair of the Women in Criminal Justice Committee. And the task force and the committee co-sponsored this event today. And I want to thank all of the folks involved in making this happen, including, most importantly, Patrice Payne. And just a reminder, this is not a CLE credited webinar. And now I will pass the baton on to our actual task force co-chair, Tina Luongo.
Thank you, and hi everybody. I'm Tina Luongo. As Mariam said, I had the honor of co-chairing the Women in Criminal Justice Task Force, and I am the chair-elect of the Criminal Justice section. So very, very honored to be in that role as well. And sort of thank you for taking interest in this subject matter. So I'm gonna set the stage, by sort of going back in time. And as you heard, our task force has been hard at work for 4 years. Now, of course, when we started this work, the other co-chair who could not be here, Professor Carla LaRoche, and we thought that this would be a multi-year task force, but not certainly 4. And COVID, let's face it, COVID had a lot to do with hitting a pause on a lot of things in life. It didn't pause our work. It certainly pivoted our work to really ensure that even during COVID, we were connecting to understand how the challenges that existed long before COVID were playing out in the lives of women in our profession during COVID. And I think we'll talk a little bit about that later as we talk about the principles, but let me go back in time. So 4 years ago, the then chair of our section, Professor Lucien Devon, and in fact, former staff member, Emily Johnson, really posed the question to the section and section leadership, about the data that she was seeing about women leaving our section. And then it really opened up a conversation about women leaving the profession. And so the task force was convened to really look at 3 critical issues, right? Highlighting and looking at why that was happening, right? Why were women leaving our profession? Or leaving as members of our section. What drove that? And what was looking at those challenges to think then, what are recommendations that could be made to address those challenges? And then, of course, we are a section. The American Bar Association has sections that provide services to members. So really looking at what are recommendations we can take internally about increasing the membership, in particular the membership of diverse women practitioners, and how that membership would help to drive our policies, resolutions that come out of our section that go to become American Bar Association policy, just like the principles. in the formation of our task force, right from the very beginning, we knew that this conversation had to be intentional. And the first thing to be intentional about was who were the members of the task force. And Professor LaRoche and I, it was important for us, right as a value established in the beginning, was to invite members of diverse background. And by that, we mean in every sense of the way, in every identity we hold, in the ways in which we practice and where we practice, in the places and jurisdictions from rural to larger metropolitan cities, to be intentional about who was going to be the task force. And we couldn't have gotten a better group of amazing people to have us do this work. And Miriam is introducing on the slides our members. We then really rolled up our sleeves as a group of people to then look at how are we going to do this work? Now, many of us have been involved in task force or working groups, either at the ABA, in our section, or just in life. And again, we knew that we wanted to do this differently. And one of our first meetings, we really talked about listening and how important to get to the bottom of what people were facing, what women were facing that were driving them out of the work, was to have listening sessions. But where we had them, that was a real critical thing. And so we really were, again, intentional about selecting places that the ABA or our section, the criminal justice section, may not have listened before. So Spokane and Albuquerque, if it wasn't a different place, or even if we were holding it in conjunction with one of our fall or spring conferences, or one of the American Bar Association larger conferences like mid-year annual, we were intentional about going into spaces or creating spaces where people could come that hadn't been together before. And then we did a series of focus groups after survey, a huge online survey, and then from that, taking all of that data and vetting it with focus groups about some of the recommendations, researching policies and actions that the ABA had already had as policies and how it aligned with what we were coming up with as recommendations. The body of work in terms of written work, in terms of presentations that the task force or members of our allies in our section were voluminous. And I think we have lots of resources that we can share. And then we got back down to the resolution, and that was resolution 501. So with that, I'm going to turn it back to Professor Arjani.
Thank you so much, Tina. And I think one thing we want to make sure to do is introduce the members of the task force who have joined us today and who are going to share with us some of their experiences. We're going to be talking more substantively about our findings and hearing from some of the participants in our listening sessions and other folks who've supported our group efforts in our next webinar. And this one is really designed to highlight the work of all of the task force members and all the things they've learned. So please join me in welcoming Lieutenant Colonel Susan Upward, Professor Sarah Redfield, April Fraser Kamara, and we may have one or two other task force members joining us in a little bit. But I'd like to introduce all of them and ask them all at this point to just share a few words about their participation in the task force, what it has meant to them, and maybe some of the most salient aspects of the work that have had meaning for them. So Lieutenant Colonel Upward, would you mind starting for us?
Sure. First of all, it's a pleasure to be here and always a pleasure to talk about the task force. As always, I always give my disclaimer. I am a active duty, Lieutenant Colonel in the Marine Corps. But what I say here today represents my own opinions and not those of the DoD, United States Navy, or the United States Marine Corps. That being said, I was pleasantly surprised to be asked to be part of the task force. At the time that we started the task force, I was in a very remote place called 29 Palms, California. And I was serving as a senior defense counsel in the Marine Corps out there. As we started the task force work, I came to realize that problems that I thought were just military specific, and not just female attorneys in the military, but military, writ large, as far as women in the military, really translated to this work. Some of the same things we heard in listening sessions were very common for women in the military, women in the Marine Corps. So as we moved along in the task force work, I became, very aware of unconscious bias, which is where the majority of my work is done now. And with Professor Sarah Redfield and Judge Donald, I've been able to increase that work in the military. But I think what I got out of the task force is not only the fact that we identified these problems, writ large across all of the places that we went, but also trying to find real solutions to how we fix this. Because I think in discussing this, we kind of found there's three groups of naysayers. Either this isn't a problem anymore, or this isn't a big problem anymore, or the third option, even if this is a problem, it's not a problem where I work, or it's not a problem for me. So I'm excited that we've, taken on this work and have kind of attacked those three viewpoints as we moved on. I think that's it. Somebody else will have something much better to say, I'm sure.
Well, thank you for sharing what you did so far. And of course, you'll have other if anything else occurs to you. I just want to make sure to welcome Judge Rachel Pickering from the Kansas Court of Appeals, who's also on the task force and is my co-chair with the Women in Criminal Justice Committee. I've been so honored to work with her in both capacities. And so we are just talking about our experiences as task force members with the work and describing what it has meant to us and maybe some of the salient experiences we've had, either in hearing from participants in the listening sessions or through the course of the work over the last 4 years. So may I invite April to go next?
Sure. So, I think one thing that's really important to note, Tina mentioned it during her overview, but this idea was really, birth was given to the idea from Lucien Dervon. And, I think it's significant. He wanted to create a group to do a deeper dive around some issues that we knew were reoccurring themes that we heard, whether we were trying to get new members to join the section, or if we were trying to groom people to retain members so they could be on a track towards leadership. We, would constantly hear, this feedback about how many women were leaving the profession. So I think one thing that is really important to note is, I really want to highlight, I don't think it is insignificant, the amazing energy and connection of the members of the task force. During our first meeting, it was actually very amazing to see women from different backgrounds and different lived experiences come together in such a cohesive way. And so one thing that I personally benefited from was coming to a space where you could take the veil off, you could be very authentic, and really, and I'm not sure that we did anything to set the tone for it, but from day one, it was a very inclusive environment where belonging was not a challenge for us as a task force. And I think hopefully we were able to take that same energy on the road when we went throughout the country to listen to other groups of women about their lived experience. I'll just say personally for me, one thing that I was very interested in hearing more about was this whole idea of how do you balance the desire to practice criminal law and to be a practitioner and also have a family and other responsibilities. I was in the midst of perhaps having maybe a 3 and a 5-year-old, and in addition to doing my day job, trying to be active in the American Bar Association. So I was specifically interested about the number of women who were leaving the profession because they felt like they couldn't, quote, have it all at the same time. And so, you know, we heard from, it was a reoccurring theme around the country. And we also heard it from different perspectives. It wasn't always caretaking from the standpoint of being a biological mother. It could have been caretaking of an aging parent or caretaking of, a sibling, but we found a reoccurring theme around women typically take on or step up to the plate in greater numbers to be caretakers. And how do you do that and also balance not just work in criminal justice, but we also want to do work that matters, and we also want to be valued. So leaving the fact that I need a part-time schedule shouldn't take me off the pathway to leadership. I should still be able to be thought of as a leader within my organization or my PD office or the prosecutor's office, even though I need some accommodations during this season in my life. So I think those are the things that really resonated with me. And I hope that as we unveil the recommendations from the task force, that same kind of energy and cohesiveness and inclusivity will really shine through in this new chapter of really trying to talk about how do we take these ideas to implementation.
Thanks, April. Professor Sarah, would you like to go next?
Sure. Whichever members of the task force precede me in speaking, it's always a hard act to follow. So I too begin by thanking all of you, and particularly thanking Miriam and Patrice for organizing this chance for us to talk about the work. I think I'm the oldest member of the task force, but if not, I'm close. I'm the oldest one on this call, let's just put it that way. And so that means I started my career when I was the first woman to do a lot of things in my practice and in my state. And many of the things that I experienced were the kinds of things that, looking back on it, I would label as both explicit and implicit bias, though at the time I didn't know those terms, right? I mean, I knew explicit bias, I didn't know implicit bias. And at the time it made me feel, I did know this, that I was invisible and unheard, and that I would go to a courthouse, or many courthouses. Some of you know Maine, some of you don't. It's a very large geographic state and many large rural courthouses. So I would often be the first woman they'd ever seen in such a place, right? In a courthouse as a lawyer. So I was always told I couldn't go wherever special place lawyers got to go. So that was common, and I was always aware of not being introduced. You know, I'd go to a meeting with my attorney general and he would forget to introduce me, right? And my voice just not being heard. And that's enough of that. That was early in my career. I went on from there to become a professor of law at the University of New Hampshire, where my experiences were similar, though I wasn't the only lonely, right? But the experiences were similar. And then I started to look at the data and the statistics, and gee whiz, golly, I looked around and looked at all those women who were going to law school. Wasn't that great, right? Wasn't that just great? And then they were all going out to practice. Wasn't that also just great? And so I said to myself mistakenly, well, okay, that's that problem taken care of. Look at all the women, right? Going to be great. They're going to go into courthouses. Nobody's going to treat them like they're some kind of giraffe or something, right? So I look back on that part of my career with regret that I did not serve my students well because I thought things were better for them. than they were. And I see all of my colleagues on the call nodding their heads because they weren't better. They were somewhat different. People weren't the first and the only anymore, but they were still pretty invisible, still pretty unheard, still unable to proceed to leadership positions. And so when asked to be on this task force, it was a chance for me to sort of make up for those years that I hadn't been working on this and hadn't been trying to help other women along. And so I was pleased to be able to do it. And like the others who've already spoken, and I'm clear about the ones who will speak, I add my voice to the value of this task force as a place where all were included, all belonged, and where those values directed who we listened to and what we did. So the result comes from that. It comes from what I, as a professor, I guess I'll say here, I'm married to an economist. I'm really trained to look at the data, right? So all the things we did were consistent with my belief that you have to know the numbers, you have to gather the data, you have to listen widely. You can't assume you have some kind of control over the information and you know best. We did all those things. And I was proud and moved to be part of that and to see the resolution that came out of that work, grounded in our own lived experience and in the data and in what we'd heard. So I believe that because of that process, there's nothing but success in our future. So I end now by saying yet one last time, or on this call anyway, such a huge thank you for all of you who made that whole process possible. And all of you who became in that process my real colleagues and friends with whom I always felt heard, seen, welcome, all the things I had for so long not felt in other places.
Thank you, Professor Redfield. I want to just welcome Judge Denise Langford Morris to our webinar and thank her for joining us. She's another task force member and force of nature, and can't wait to hear from her. I think maybe Judge Pickering, maybe you could go next, and then Judge Langford Morris could share your insights in terms of what, on a personal level, service on the task force has meant to you and some of the poignant experiences you had, as a task force member.
So just to divide my talks up, first is the selection. So I'm in Kansas, the great state of Kansas. So representing the Midwest, I'm also Hispanic. And so I brought that to the table, but more so, I also brought a dual role of having served as prosecutor and defense attorney. So that's what I was bringing to the table when I first began with the task force. So I thought that's what I can bring in terms of my skill set. I eventually moved to the bench. That's in later 2019. So I'm going to talk about that in just a second. But I think the key part to the success of this task force was that initial setting. For me, one of the first listening sessions in Albuquerque, New Mexico, because we created a safe space for these female attorneys. A lot of them said to us, and if somebody else has already said this, my apologies. They said, nobody's ever asked me about this before. That resonated through all our listening sessions. Nobody's talked to me about this. So they wanted to give us their story. And because we created such a safe space of no judgment, listening and listening only, and not saying you're doing it wrong, or this is how you could do things better. We listened only, and that role created the key to the good data that we received because people were buying in to what we were doing. So it was a legitimacy to the process. So that to me, and that goes out to the co-chairs and a reporter of the setting of that law school setting. So Albuquerque to me was critical towards the fusion of having all the task force members come on, and everybody knew right now it was listening. So because of that, we then spurred on. And the second part I want to mention is because we heard about all these challenges, the key that I received from other task force members and those in the listening session was finally being able to put a label on what we had all gone through. And that to me, as an attorney, as a judge, as soon as we put a label on it, I was able to understand, oh, that's a microaggression. Oh, it is? When he calls me by my first name, but somebody else by their surname, yes, that's a microaggression. Or the fact that you're never introduced. That's those little things, labeling it, helped me understand once we put a label, it does exist. So that is the second part that this task force did that was important for me. And the third I want to bring out is, as a judge, once I realized what was happening, I wanted to take that awareness and use it on the bench. To understand the role that a judge plays in setting the tone in the courtroom. I made sure I didn't interrupt women as much as the men. So there's little things like that. Not interrupting as much, although I'm still at fault. Trust me, those who saw me, to be flexible with calendars. So when we were on the pandemic, we had Zoom hearings. I just have one quick anecdote. We had an attorney who would appear at an 8:30 hearing in her house on Zoom. Then at 9:30, she may appear like in her car. And then at 10, she would appear in her office. And as a judge, from this listening sessions, I knew she's a dual caretaker. She's getting her kids to school. She's dropping them off. She's moving from the house to school to work. And so I was trying to be, from the listening sessions, respectful of that dual role she was doing and not draw attention to the fact that, wait, wasn't she just in her car half an hour ago? Don't say anything. Let her get where she needs to go and understand that she's juggling it all. So that selection process was important for us, bringing that viewpoint, the authenticity of those safety of those listening sessions, and then adding to the integrity of those listening sessions to the data, and then being able to use it on the bench. That awareness was key. And I'm going to say one last thing. It made me a compassionate judge because I was able to hear what was going on by the practitioners. So I'm very grateful for being part of this task.
Judge Pickering, thank you so much. If I could just pick up on two things you said. I know you've talked about also how the listening sessions have helped you as an employer of law clerks and interns. And I wonder if you'd be willing to share, how you've been able to translate what you heard in the listening sessions into your role also as employer. And then I also quickly want to give Professor Barbara Creel, another task force member, a lot of credit for helping me to set up that Albuquerque listening session. She is a colleague at the University of New Mexico School of Law and also a task force member and an enrolled member of the Pueblo of Jemez, and did a tremendous job of helping us reach out to attorneys, Native women and other women from across the state, all over this, the beautiful state of New Mexico in rural areas. And she brought folks to the table who otherwise had not been invited to these spaces before. So I want to make sure we mention her. But yeah, I'd love to, if you could talk to us more about your employer hat.
Well, yes. So the employer hat is, well, now that I've heard about these little microaggressions and realizing that employers do sometimes trip up with that. When I hired my research, well, first as a district court judge, my administrative assistant, I looked at her resume, but I also looked at her as the person and where her goals are. And that to me was, I may only be able to work with this person for 2 years because my job is not only to have her as an assistant in the courthouse, but also to mentor her and get her on the way. And so that's what I started. It's like, I'm going to reach out to those who want to go to law school, who want to get their path, let them get started in the courthouse first. So that instead of finding somebody who is there to stay, like maybe I'm just a person, the conduit to get them to their next step. So that is something I've played a role in. And also with research attorneys is, where do you need to go? And maybe you should be working with me because I can help you get there. So that to me is the importance of helping them ascend, and then showing them the respect. And the third, if I could say one last thing, Professor Redfield said about talking about not being seen or heard. It's vital for young attorneys to know that they have a voice and somebody values their judgment. And so that is something I'm trying to do on the bench, because that builds self-confidence and allows them to be even stronger attorneys in the courtroom.
Thanks so much. Judge Langford Morris, we'd love to hear from you now.
Thank you so much, Miriam. I'm so honored to join on this auspicious occasion where we are sharing all that we learned and all that we shared with the Women's Task Force work for approximately 4 years. It's been an honor to work with you. And as Judge Pickering said, you helped us tremendously. And our two great chairs, I'm sure that everyone has heard their names over and over, but I have to add mine to the fact that it has been an honor and a privilege. You know that I served as a judge for 30 years. I am recently retired, so I'm not lending my voice from the actual bench, but I'm working as a private judge with JAMS. And so I'm still involved in judging matters and in the community for sure. Most people that know me know that I've been very, very active in the ABA. In fact, I'm at an ABA conference right now in Seattle. And I try to give back as much as I possibly can. But I have to say that being a member of this task force has been a true honor, because the membership, the women that serve on the task force, are absolutely extraordinary. And with all of the women's groups that I have served in throughout my years, and I'm seasoned, very seasoned, but it has truly been a learning experience and a privilege for me to serve with these women. I have worked very closely with Judge Pickering and you as chairs of the Women's Committee in the criminal justice section. And I have brought with me to the task force my experience as a former assistant prosecutor in my jurisdiction for many years, handling every type of case from misdemeanors to murder, human trafficking, and also I was in private practice and then an assistant United States attorney, civil division, where I also handled quasi-criminal matters before I became a judge. And it's been a warm, bonding experience to serve on this task force. And the listening sessions, I can't say enough about how informative they were, where people came and bore their souls to all of us. They shared their most innermost experiences, some that they had never told anyone else. So it was humbling to listen to all of the details that were shared. And some of them come through loud and clear in the resolution that we had passed in the House of Delegates. I serve in the House of Delegates, and I have had many of the members of the House of Delegates share how great it was that we were able to accomplish the passage of the resolution that's going to be put to task and help so many women throughout our profession. We all know how this task force began, because there definitely is a need to help women as they gain job entry into the market, as they seek promotions, as they try to help others as they come along. And I was listening to April as she was talking about her incredible, basically commitment to staying active, and yet while raising a family. It takes me back to the fact that when I was in law school, I had a young daughter, and I was trying to do my best to raise her And as a woman, when you're in law school and you're a young lawyer, you need help. And at that time, I didn't have the help from my husband that I needed. He was missing in action. That's another story. But the bottom line is, I recall sitting in class one night, and one of the gentlemen said, well, my wife is taking our kids out to trick or treat. And we were all sitting in class, and I'm thinking to myself, wow, I wish I had a wife and all these things that you need in order to be a success. And the thing that I learned though most, I could go on and on about the benefits of serving on this task force, but I must share that in New York, when I co-chaired the platform where we met with many judges from across the country, Judge Bernice Donnell and I were co-chairs of that task force. And what we did is we brought in judges from everywhere, and many of them were visiting in New York at the time because we joined the National Bar Association and our ABA task force. And we brought in many judges of color, and they shared where the nexus meets, where you have difficulty with not only sex issues of trying to integrate the profession, but also racial composites that cause difficulty along your way in trying to succeed. And so when you talk about that mixture, it was an honor and privilege to hear from fellow judges, because what lawyers sometimes forget, as judges, we are human beings too. And we bring to the table, to the courtroom, all of life's experiences. Now, obviously, we can't hold against any parties anything that has happened involving us as individuals. But I go way back like Professor Redfield, and I recall as a young lawyer being told, don't wear a dress to court, make sure that you wear pants, and all kinds of things that were told by the many, many men that I worked with. There were very few women working in the prosecutor's office when I was there. And people were shocked to find me as the prosecutor. But what I learned is that it's so important to give the bonding experience and what we gained as individuals serving together, to bring that back and share it with young people. When we did the session at Howard University, and we had young law students come from all across the country, and they had many questions about, how did you become a judge? How did you do it back then? And it really is something that you must continue. And what we all have done is we've continued to mentor these young women. I recall that there was one that showed up in the Howard session, and she ultimately became a law clerk to Judge Bernice Donnell. And I'm still in touch with her. She's very active in the ABA, and we talk regularly. So the mentoring can never be diminished. And I think that we experienced the serious need for continued mentoring of young women, middle-aged women, and even seasoned women. You can never learn enough because the law is ever changing, and there's always new obstacles to overcome. As a Zoom court judge during COVID, for 2 years, Zooming right into the jail and meeting with defendants and their lawyers and prosecutors, basically from my kitchen, I learned that you have to really stay alert. And that's the other thing that we gained from serving on this task force. And I brought that with me into the Zoom court proceedings that I held on many criminal matters whether I was doing evidentiary hearings. Of course, we couldn't do trials, but the staying alert and trying to help those people, whether they were women, men, or whoever that were appearing in our courtrooms during Zoom. So I have gained tremendously, and I could talk about this forever, but I will say that I also agree with all of the comments that have been made, and I won't repeat those, but thank you for the honor and privilege of serving with you, Miriam, all the members that are here today, and some of those that could not join us today. It has certainly been a privilege, and I am still continuing to learn from all of you.
Thank you, Judge Langford Morris. I'm always inspired by your wisdom, and I am grateful for you as well. And I'd like to invite co-chair of our task force, Tina Longo, to share about their own experiences with the task force. And maybe one of the things you could pick up on is this theme of belonging and mutual support that you and Professor LaRoche, the other co-chair, so intentionally created and you know, in selecting members of the task force. I think it was on the front of your minds how to create a spirit of cooperation, collaboration, and support. So if you wouldn't mind addressing that as well, that would be wonderful.
I will, sure. And I think I will say that while Professor LaRoche and I hoped for that, you hope and then you act and then you wish for the best. Here, I think we created that sense of belonging as a group that came into the room, reflecting, right, the intention, the success that you have when you take intentional acts to create belonging. I've shared this story a few times, and it's sort of a personal one for me, which was really sort of reflecting. So we did, as I said, we did 11 listening sessions, and so from the first one to the second one to the third one, we sat and listened. And as a task force member, I was listening. And then what we would do at the end, right, we'd all come together, if you all remember, right, and we'd debrief. And much of the time, the task force members were sharing very much what Judge Pickering shared and what you heard, which was as the task force members were listening, they were reflecting on their personal stories of the same challenges that the other people were sharing. Excuse me, my allergies are terrible. And I will say that I sat time and time through these debriefings, certainly understanding the challenges, certainly having empathy for much of what I heard, but I didn't often reflect on a personal story I had. And I had to start to dig deep as to why. And it is because of the way in which my gender expression, how I live my gender expression, right? I'm non-binary in nature. The way you see me dressed now is the way I never put on a dress. I never put on heels in front of a jury. I never put on pearls in front of a jury. This is me. And you have to name what that might be about. And that is misogyny, right? That I started to recognize that I did not have those same stories about a judge never using my last name, about co-counsel making a pass at me, about wondering, being asked whether, when I needed a break, what that was about, like none of that. I walked in and I very much didn't have those experiences. And it's about misogyny because I express the way in which the majority of heterosexual men, and particularly white men, as I am a white person, though queer, treated everybody else. And so I got lumped into that. and derived a strange privilege from my queerness in that way. And it certainly sort of became aware when our listening sessions were open, as you all know, to cisgender and trans women. And someone shared that she had transitioned in when she was a district attorney. And so her experience when she was perceived, right, by everybody else to be male was very different than her experience after she became, right, after she began to express and transition to her true self in the role, still in that same office. So I raised that because it was really important for me to sort of name that, but really important when we think about the role misogyny plays and all we're talking about in terms of these challenges. So, and that the answer to it is to build allyship, right? The fact that Lucy and Devon and then other chairs of our section, both female, April, and other males, Wayne McKenzie, Justin Bingham, have allied with us to name that which drives these challenges, which is misogyny. And that distances the sense of belonging in a courtroom. So, but now I'm going to tee it off to you, because as the reporter, you're answering you ask the questions in interview, but I'm going to ask you, tell us about your personal reflection.
Thanks, Tina. Well, I might even get emotional telling this story, and some members of the task force maybe don't even know, but I was at a point in my career where I was looking for an opportunity to produce scholarship as a professor that felt meaningful, that felt like it was going to actually have an impact in helping people's lives. And I think my other scholarship hopefully does that, but I was just looking for a new sort of field to explore when I got an email one day from Professor Sarah Redfield through a listserv announcing the invitation to interested applicants to apply to be the task force reporter. And having known Sarah in my prior life, working with the Marshall Brennan Constitutional Literacy Project over some years, I trusted her and I reached out to her and I said, what do you think about this role? Do you think this would be a smart thing for me to do as a sort of I was midway through achieving tenure, at my law school. And we had a great conversation and she said, I think it would be fantastic. I think you would enjoy it very much. And I think it would be, helpful for the task force. And I still remember the conversation I had. I think, Tina, you were not available, but Carla interviewed me one night. I was actually in my closet in the apartment I was renting in Albuquerque at the time. And my son had just gone to sleep. I think he must have been about 6 at that time, close to 7. Yeah. And I sort of whispered my answers to her, hoping that I was speaking loudly enough that she could hear me. But I just, we connected very, very easily in that conversation in a way that felt so powerful. And I'm so grateful that I had the opportunity to serve this task force and to, to get to know all of you so intimately. I think we've created lifelong friendships and working relationships. I love the story that Professor Langford Morris shared about the young woman from our Howard listening session who clerked for Judge Donald, and she stayed in touch with several task force members I know. And there are many stories like that. So I think the synergies that we all have with one another have also, have sort of inspired us to create those synergies in other places. And you've heard about that. I'd love to share, so on a personal level, my family immigrated from Iran. Everybody knows what's going on there, what has been going on really since they left in the 1970s, which is that it has been a place of a real challenge for women, especially women who have voices, who want to be heard and who want to be able to be free and enjoy their lives and self-actualize. And so I've always been so grateful for the opportunity to be not only an American, but also to have the platform to be a law professor and to be the task force reporter for this incredibly groundbreaking work in the space of gender equity. It's just, I don't take it lightly. I take it very seriously and feel that it is, it absolutely has shaped who I am as a person and who I am as an academic. I want to just share a few slides. I see that we're like running low on time. So I'm going to just let those who are listening know, and we'd love to hear from them if there are any questions or comments from those who are participating in this session in just a minute. But I wanted to let everybody know that we have, and this has been referenced already, we have produced quite an impressive amount of opportunities to read about our work, opportunities to listen to our work. And I want to share some of those with all of you right now. So I'm going to just fix my technical issue here. There we go. So we have, and these are things anyone listening, you can just, Google it. Really, if you Google my name, then these things will come up. But also, here are some citations for some of the things we've written. We have some longer articles. Sprinting a Marathon is the first piece that really described the full amount of research that's been done in this area of gender equity and legal employment, and particularly I'm sorry, Toughen Up Buttercup was the first piece. And then Pulling Back the Curtain was published on the ABA's website, the Criminal Justice Section's website, describing our subsequent work, and finally Sprinting a Marathon. We also have many shorter articles you can see written by many of the women in this room, as well as some of our allies. Those appear in the Criminal Justice Magazine, the quarterly publication of the ABA Criminal Justice Section. It's an incredibly well regarded and well written and researched magazine. I encourage folks to take a look at that. And some of our listening session participants wrote about their experiences. I'm really happy to share one person here on this slide. Joy Applewhite is a young woman who wrote one of our columns in the Criminal Justice Magazine, Brave, Bold, Booked, and Balanced. She attended American University Washington College of Law, participated in our listening session at Howard Law School, and was connected to me by our mutual same criminal law professor, separated by 25 years, Angela Davis, who, and Joy is now, she's going to become a member of the New Mexico Bar officially. She has been for a little while. She works as a public defender in Southern New Mexico. And I'm excited to go to her swearing-in ceremony in a couple of weeks. Finally, we've got a bunch of podcasts, and many members of the task force have been interviewed about their work on the task force. So I welcome those who are listening to consider looking up some of these podcast episodes through the JustPod, the Criminal Justice Section's podcast. So with that, I wonder if there are any questions or comments from the attendees in the room. Okay, seeing none at the moment, and please feel free to just drop a note in the chat if you do. I wonder if there are any task force members who have additional thoughts they want to share in closing.
I actually wanted to share something that we did to further the work a little bit that I think really comes from, again, the value we centered, which is sort of belonging, and how do you how do you take what we heard, get a recommendation, and move it to implementation. And that is that we had a spring conference in Memphis. We just all came back. It was last week. And we held the first, an inaugural, we'll call it, Women in Criminal Justice Dine-In. And it was, and this is where it comes from, that we heard, right, how sometimes it's really tough to be somebody who walking into a room when you don't know anybody, but you know you should be able to network, and you want to network. You need to network for lots of reasons, especially if you're a new lawyer or law student or just new, right? This is a new thing. And Cynthia Orr, who was a former chair of our section and is a leader in our section, hosted a dine-in where we invited first-time attendees of our conference, who were women, to join April and Judge Langford Morris, myself, but more importantly, the president of the ABA, Deborah Enix Ross, joined for the dinner. And it was a small group of people from different parts of their lives, and it was amazing. And out of that, 2 people joined. The 2 new people joined our section because they created a relationship. So relationships matter, and taking something just as a thought like that and piloting it really makes a difference when you are intentional about creating belonging. I don't know, April, we have 1 minute if you wanted to sort of share your thought since you were there.
Yeah, absolutely. I think about it oftentimes, the work that we have done. I often say it's not rocket science. I think it's something about creating authentic spaces and allowing people to show up and just be who they are. The dinner on last week was a perfect example of that. But also, I just want to note, Tina, I think it's really important to note that it just really depends on where you practice, whether or not you are surrounded by or exposed to a community of people. The benefit of the American Bar Association is not just about your local practice, but being connected to people across the country. And it does something to grow you as a person. I think Judge Pickering talked about it. It allows you to think differently. So I think I really want to highlight the fact that I think the work of the task force has a nurtured thought partnership to allow you to perhaps look at an issue that you are dealing with in your jurisdiction, but from like a national perspective. And so that's one thing I think that is uniquely beautiful about the connection that we have made here through the ABA Women in Criminal Justice Task Force.
Thanks for sharing that. Really important. I think we're at time. Patrice is probably saying, yep, we're at time. So please watch out for our other upcoming webinars, particularly on the resolutions and our next steps. And up on the screen, if you have any questions, that's my contact and Professor Aranjani's. And thank you for joining us this afternoon.
Thank you. On behalf of the ABA Criminal Justice Section, we'd like to thank our panelists and our participants for joining us today.